Henry Lowell was the kind of man you'd forget if you passed him on the street. Ordinary, quiet, invisible. Detective Maggie Fuller, on the other hand, was the name everyone in Shelby Creek now knew. The woman tasked with unraveling a nightmare no one could have imagined. But as Maggie stared at the horrifying photographs laid out before her, the mutilated remains, the cryptic symbols, she realized with chilling certainty Henry wasn't the only monster in this story. And worse, the monsters were far from finished. Shelby Creek was a picture-perfect small town nestled deep in the Midwest, where life moved at an unhurried pace. It was a place of Sunday potlucks, high school football games, and generations of families growing up side by side. Everyone knew each other's names, and gossip revolved around mundane matters like who won the pie contest or whose lawn needed mowing. In this serene backdrop, crime was almost non-existent. The occasional petty theft or drunken altercation at the local bar was the worst law enforcement had to deal with. That sense of safety was shattered one crisp autumn morning when a jogger, following their regular route along Pinewood Trail, stumbled upon something horrific. At first, they thought it was trash, a worn canvas bag discarded near the tree line. But as they got closer, a foul stench hit them, one so pungent it stopped them in their tracks. With trembling hands, they peeked inside and saw something they could never unsee: human remains, dismembered and arranged with an almost deliberate care. Panic surged as they ran back to town, calling 911 with a voice shaking from fear. When the police arrived, the scene was worse than they could have imagined. The bag contained a human torso and severed limbs, each wrapped in plastic as though preserving them for some grotesque purpose. There was no sign of the head, no clues about the victim's identity, and no blood trail to hint at where the crime might have occurred. The remains had been placed there intentionally. This was no accident or hurried act of disposal. To the responding officers, it felt like a message, though its meaning was disturbingly unclear. Detective Maggie Fuller, a veteran investigator with a reputation for handling the most unsettling cases, was called in from a neighboring county. Though she had encountered grisly crime scenes before, this one was different. There was an eerie precision to the way the body had been dissected, a level of control that suggested the killer had experience, or worse, practice. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that whoever did this wasn't done. The placement of the bag, so close to a well-traveled trail, felt calculated, almost like an invitation to be discovered. As news of the discovery spread, the town's peaceful facade crumbled. Fear took root in the community. Parents kept their children indoors, businesses closed early, and the usual friendly chatter was replaced by whispers of suspicion. Rumors swirled about who the victim might be and what kind of person could commit such a heinous act. The quiet, predictable lives of Shelby Creek's residents were now overshadowed by dread. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to extract clues from the remains, but progress was slow. The victim's fingerprints had been removed, and the body showed no distinguishing marks. The lack of identification deepened the mystery. Why would someone go to such lengths to conceal their victim's identity while leaving the remains in such a conspicuous location? The question haunted Maggie and her team as they began piecing together what little evidence they had. What no one knew at the time was that this discovery was only the beginning. The horror of Pinewood Trail would soon escalate into a nightmare that would grip the entire country. But for the people of Shelby Creek, the cracks in their peaceful existence had already begun to spread. The town would never be the same. The gruesome discovery in Shelby Creek left investigators scrambling for answers. As forensic teams examined the remains, they found something shocking. Hidden deep within the chest cavity was a small, folded piece of paper. On it was a symbol, drawn in a deep crimson ink that could have been blood. The symbol resembled an Ouroboros, a snake consuming its own tail, an ancient image representing cycles and eternity. Beneath it were the chilling words, "The first of many." This revelation turned an already horrific crime into something even more sinister. It wasn't just a murder, it was a message. The meticulous dismemberment, the deliberate placement of the body, and now the cryptic note pointed to a killer who wasn't merely acting on impulse, but carrying out something planned, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. The note became the first real clue, but it raised more questions than it answered. The Ouroboros symbol wasn't commonly associated with any known criminal patterns. Was it a reference to mythology? A personal obsession of the killer? Or part of something larger and more horrifying? Investigators reached out to experts in criminal psychology, symbology, and even fringe occult practices, hoping for a lead, but no definitive answers came. The media caught wind of the case, and soon Shelby Creek thrust into the national spotlight. News outlets ran sensational headlines about a possible serial killer, branding the anonymous murderer with ominous nicknames like the Ouroboros Killer. Reporters descended on the town, interviewing terrified residents and speculating wildly about the killer's motives. What had once been a peaceful and obscure place now felt like a fishbowl under the glaring light of public scrutiny. Weeks passed with little progress. Forensic analysis of the body yielded no matches in the missing persons database, no leads on the victim's identity, and no DNA evidence pointing to a suspect. The killer had taken extraordinary precautions to erase any traceable clues, reinforcing the notion that they were experienced and careful. Then, another body was discovered. This time, it was left in a derelict barn miles from Pinewood Trail. Like the first, it was dismembered and arranged in a deliberate manner. Another note was found, bearing the same symbol and a chilling message. The cycle continues. The second crime scene shared the same haunting precision as the first, but it offered a new clue, a small trace of adhesive on one of the victim's limbs. The adhesive was a type used in industrial manufacturing, a seemingly minor detail, but one that provided a potential connection to the killer's activities. As the case escalated, investigators grew increasingly desperate. Local law enforcement called in reinforcements, and the FBI began to profile the killer. The psychological profile painted a portrait of someone highly intelligent, emotionally detached, and likely motivated by a deeply ingrained ideology or belief system. This wasn't the work of someone who would stop on their own. The realization weighed heavily on the community. If this was only the beginning, how many more lives would be lost? What was the killer's endgame, and why had they chosen Shelby Creek as their stage? The police worked tirelessly to find answers, but with each passing day, the terror deepened, and the killer remained steps ahead. The town braced itself for what seemed inevitable, another gruesome chapter in this horrifying saga. The second murder deepened the nightmare gripping Shelby Creek. What had initially seemed like a single horrifying event was now part of something much larger. Two bodies, two cryptic notes, and an elusive killer who seemed to revel in their own twisted game. The media's interest turned into a frenzy, with news vans lining the streets and reporters chasing down anyone who might offer a soundbite. The once quiet town was now a place of fear and spectacle. Forensic teams continued their meticulous work, but answers were slow in coming. The adhesive found on the second victim offered the first real lead. It was a rare industrial compound used primarily in specific manufacturing processes. This narrowed the search to businesses within a 3-state radius, but even with this breakthrough, the sheer number of possibilities felt overwhelming. Investigators knew the clock was ticking. The killer's messages suggested more deaths were coming. While the forensic team worked on physical evidence, behavioral profilers from the FBI analyzed the killer's actions. They concluded that the person responsible was not only intelligent, but methodical. The choice of the Ouroboros symbol spoke volumes. It wasn't random. The symbol of the snake eating its own tail suggested themes of infinity, cycles, and renewal. This wasn't the work of someone who killed out of rage or impulse. It was someone with a belief system, someone who viewed these acts as part of a grander scheme. As the team pored over cold cases, patterns began to emerge. Similar murders, meticulously dismembered bodies, cryptic notes, and evidence that seemed deliberately scarce were identified in neighboring states. Some of these cases dated back nearly a decade, though none had received the same level of attention as the Shelby Creek murders. The Ouroboros symbol had appeared before, but had been overlooked as a detail without significance. Now, it tied these crimes together. The killer's ability to evade capture for so long pointed to a high degree of planning. They seemed to choose their victims carefully, leaving little behind to connect them to the crime. Victimology offered few clues. Young and old, male and female, the victims came from various walks of life. There was no clear pattern in who was targeted, which made predicting the next attack nearly impossible. The task force's frustration grew with each passing week. Every time they thought they had a lead, it fizzled out. An abandoned vehicle reported near one of the crime scenes turned out to be unrelated. A suspicious drifter, questioned by police, had an alibi. The killer had the uncanny ability to leave just enough behind to taunt investigators while avoiding any real exposure. Meanwhile, fear consumed Shelby Creek. Schools canceled evening events, businesses closed early, and no one dared venture out alone. For the first time in its history, residents began installing security cameras and bolting their doors at night. The town's collective sense of safety had been irreparably shattered. Then came the biggest twist of all. A partial match to the adhesive was linked to a small factory in a neighboring state. It wasn't definitive, but it was the first tangible thread investigators could pull. This discovery injected a new sense of urgency into the case. The killer had proven they could strike anywhere, but now the task force felt they were closing in. What they didn't know was that the killer was watching, anticipating their every move, and preparing for the next deadliest act. The partial match to the adhesive was the break investigators had been desperate for, though it was far from a complete answer. The compound was traced to a specific manufacturing plant in a neighboring state, but the plant produced thousands of units daily, distributing them across a wide region. Investigators meticulously combed through employee records, purchase orders, and shipping logs, hoping to identify anyone with a possible connection to the crimes. Each new piece of data felt like a potential lead, but the sheer volume of information slowed progress to a crawl. As investigators delved into the factory's records, another body was discovered. This time, the crime scene was a derelict motel just off a rural highway. The victim was arranged in the same horrifying manner, and the now familiar symbol of the Ouroboros was painted on the cracked wall above the remains. Beneath it was another chilling message: "You are running out of time." The third murder pushed the task force into overdrive. They intensified their efforts, now armed with a growing sense of urgency. Surveillance footage from the area revealed a possible breakthrough: a grainy video showing an old van parked outside the motel late on the night of the murder. The van was a beat-up, unremarkable vehicle, but a partial view of its license plate provided investigators with a critical lead. The plate was traced to a man named Henry Lowell, a reclusive handyman who lived in a remote area just over the state line. Henry had no significant criminal record, but his history raised red flags. He had a reputation as a loner and had been let go from several jobs due to erratic behavior. Neighbors described him as strange, someone who kept to himself and rarely interacted with others. He fit the profile: a quiet, meticulous individual with the skills and access to materials that could explain the murders. When police raided Henry Lowell's rural property, they found evidence that was as chilling as it was damning. Maps with marked locations of the crime scenes were pinned to the walls of his cluttered workshop. Surgical tools, some of them bloodstained, were laid out in meticulous order. And perhaps most disturbing of all, photographs of the victims, images that had never been released to the public, were discovered hidden in a locked cabinet. It seemed like the case was finally solved, but there was one glaring problem: Henry Lowell was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, leaving behind only a cryptic note scrawled on the back of one of the maps: "The cycle is unbroken. You'll never stop it." The manhunt for Lowell consumed every available resource. Police scoured nearby woods, checked abandoned properties, and interviewed anyone who might have seen him. His image was plastered on news broadcasts and online bulletins, warning the public to remain vigilant. But Henry Lowell had seemingly disappeared into thin air, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. As the search continued, forensic analysis of the workshop revealed something even more horrifying. DNA evidence found on the tools didn't match the known victims. This chilling discovery suggested that the body count was higher than anyone had realized. Lowell wasn't just a suspect. He was potentially the key to a sprawling nightmare, far more complex than anyone had imagined. The realization struck with grim clarity: capturing Lowell might not end the killings. It could be only the beginning of unraveling a far darker mystery. The hunt for Henry Lowell consumed the efforts of law enforcement. But as the days turned into weeks, hope of finding him alive began to wane. Authorities scoured every inch of the wooded area surrounding his property, followed up on countless tips, and monitored highways and bus stations, but Lowell remained elusive. Meanwhile, the investigation into his life painted a disturbing picture. Lowell had been a drifter for much of his adult life, working menial jobs that kept him off the radar. He had no close friends or family, no digital footprint, and no significant ties to any community. It was as if he had built his entire existence around staying invisible. His fixation on the Ouroboros symbol appeared to be deeply personal, though the sheer level of detail in his workshop suggested something far more organized. Investigators began to wonder, was Lowell truly working alone? This question took on new urgency when more forensic evidence from Lowell's property revealed DNA from an unidentified source. It didn't match any of the known victims or even Lowell himself. Instead, it pointed to someone else entirely, a possible accomplice. The idea that Lowell might be part of a larger network sent shockwaves through the task force. Could the Ouroboros symbol signify something beyond just Lowell's twisted ideology? While investigators grappled with this new lead, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A hiker in a remote part of the state stumbled upon an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was almost entirely hidden by overgrowth, its location so isolated it wasn't on any official maps. Inside, authorities found a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls of the cabin were covered in symbols and writings, all centered on the Ouroboros. There were detailed diagrams and notes referencing cycles of death and rebirth, and rituals that spoke to a disturbing philosophy. More photographs of crime scenes were found, including ones that didn't match any of the known cases. This cabin wasn't just a hideout, it was a shrine to the killer's beliefs. And Henry Lowell was there. He was seated in the middle of the room, gaunt and unshaven, muttering to himself in a trance-like state. He offered no resistance as officers moved in to arrest him, but his capture brought little relief. Lowell refused to answer any questions, speaking only in cryptic phrases like, "The cycle cannot be broken," and "The snake has many heads." As investigators pressed him for details, the true scope of the nightmare began to emerge. Lowell's writings hinted at a network, others like him who shared his beliefs and operated under the same dark doctrine. This wasn't the work of a single killer, but part of something much larger. Each crime was part of a coordinated effort to fulfill a grotesque ideology centered on chaos, death, and renewal. Despite their best efforts, law enforcement couldn't identify the members of this supposed network. Lowell's refusal to cooperate left them with more questions than answers. The Ouroboros was no longer just a symbol of Lowell's crimes. It was the mark of an organization that might still be out there, planning their next act. The terror that began in Shelby Creek didn't end with Lowell's capture. If anything, his arrest marked the beginning of a new, more horrifying chapter. The case served as a grim reminder that evil doesn't always work alone, and that some mysteries are deeper and darker than anyone can imagine. Shelby Creek would never return to its former peace, and the Ouroboros remained a haunting reminder of the evil that lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike again.